Previously in Episode 1, Public Orientation, we, Attorney Mick Harrison of the Lawyers Committee for 911 Inquiry and architect Richard Gage, introduced you to our nearly 2-decade-long effort to achieve government accountability and transparency regarding the explosive evidence of the World Trade Center destruction. We walked you through the specific legal cases that have brought us to Washington, D.C., and we provided a very brief summary of the key points of evidence in this historic mission, justice on behalf of the 9/11 victims and their family members. We also shared with you how you can participate in a number of ways, including as a virtual grand juror. Now, starting with Episode 2, via our presentation to our stand-in virtual grand jurors, we provide the forensic evidence, eyewitness, and expert testimony to the actual grand jurors, which will be reformatted specifically for them. Now, Episode 2.
Ladies and gentlemen of the grand jury, my name is Mick Harrison. I am a public interest attorney representing the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry and assisting architect Richard Gage in this presentation of evidence. I will try to be of assistance to you as members of the grand jury regarding legal issues that may arise during the presentation of this crime scene evidence of what may fairly be described as the crime of the century. I was hoping to be present with you today, given the importance of the matter, but events beyond my control prevented my being present. Before I turn to my colleague, Richard Gage, to present the evidence, let me give you a brief background on myself and the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. The Lawyers Committee is a registered nonprofit. Its mission is transparency and accountability regarding the tragic events of 9/11. The Lawyers Committee has been bringing legal actions and freedom of information requests and doing investigations for the purpose of bringing the full truth to the American people of what actually happened on 9/11. That includes investigations that were submitted to the U.S. Attorney's Office and to Congress. I've been representing the Lawyers Committee as their litigation director. I'm a public interest lawyer, 32 years experience, graduated from the District of Columbia School of Law. I'm admitted to practice in the state of Pennsylvania and to several federal courts.
Thank you, Mick. Thank you for this historic opportunity. Members of the grand jury, I'm Richard Gage, AIA 30-year architect and member of the American Institute of Architects. I'm the founder and former CEO of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, which now has 3,500 architects and engineers signed on to the petition, demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Today, you'll begin to discover why. My organization is now known as Richard Gage 9/11. We're committed to educating the public, the media, and government representatives about the explosive evidence involved in these 3 skyscraper collapses. Most of my career has been focused on medium to large commercial and institutional projects in the San Francisco Bay Area, with a more recent $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing.
Ladies and gentlemen of the grand jury, I want to provide you a brief legal overview of your role, your tasks, your duties, and your authority to give you some guidance as you go forward with this important inquiry. The purposes of the federal special grand jury are first to determine whether a crime has been committed. If you find no crime has been committed, you will not need to go to the second task, which is identifying who done it. As you proceed with your first task, you'll be collecting evidence, evaluating the factual weight of that evidence, applying the law to the evidence, and you will need to determine in your own best judgment if certain federal crimes, such as federal bombing crimes, have been committed. To give you a little more of a concrete feel for this task, one of the federal crimes that has been reported and which you are asked to investigate is a federal bombing crime. Federal law prohibits, as you might imagine, bombing of places of public use and government facilities. Here's what that criminal statute says in part. Offenses. In general, whoever unlawfully delivers, places, discharges, or detonates an explosive or other lethal device in, into, or against a place of public use with the intent to cause death or serious bodily injury, or with the intent to cause extensive destruction of such a place, where such destruction results in or is likely to result in major economic loss, shall be punished as prescribed in subsection C of Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Section 2332F. It should be noted that that particular crime and others at issue here do have the death penalty. And although the crimes you're investigating were initiated in 2001 and may well have been planned before 2001, these crimes may still be prosecuted. There is no statute of limitations for these crimes. Now, your second task, if you do find evidence of a crime, is to decide whether to indict a suspect for that crime. You do not require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. I repeat, you do not require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's because, notwithstanding what you've seen on television, you are not trying anyone's guilt here. That is a later step in the process after an indictment. You're doing an investigative task here, and your only decision is whether, in your own best judgment, reasonable or probable cause exists to believe that a crime has been committed. As you proceed with this task, please remember that the grand jury is independent of the other branches of government. You have no obligation to follow direction from the U.S. Attorney, from a court, from Congress, from any public official. You may well get guidance, possibly helpful guidance, from the U.S. Attorney, and that's fine. But in the final analysis, you proceed with the investigation in a manner that you deem appropriate, and your ultimate conclusion is yours to make, no one else's. Now, you're free to consider, in performing these tasks, all types of evidence. You may consider any evidence a reasonable person might use to reach logical conclusions. Formal rules of evidence need not be followed. You may have seen on television that in trials, lawyers object to various kinds of evidence, typically hearsay, and a lot of evidence is not allowed. But this is not a trial. This is a grand jury investigation. So you're free to consider any evidence you wish, hearsay or not. Some of the evidence that Richard will be explaining to you is technical. Some of it will be eyewitness. And you should be asking yourself questions as you listen to Richard and to the experts he'll be presenting to help form your judgment on these two questions. Was a crime committed, in this case a bombing crime? And if so, is there reason to believe a particular suspect committed that crime? You'll be looking at, for example, forensic evidence, including laboratory analysis World Trade Center dust, in which it has been reported that explosive residue was found. You'll be looking and hearing at testimony and opinions from experts regarding the characteristics of the collapse of Building 7 on 9/11 and how that does or does not compare to a controlled demolition using explosives. You will be presented with eyewitness testimony from a number of first responders present on the scene at 9/11 who survived. Their testimony from the Fire Department of New York was preserved officially and was obtained by the New York Times. So you'll get a chance to hear firsthand what some of those first responders saw and heard on 9/11. And there are some unusual circumstances you'll also be hearing about, circumstantial evidence of what we might call anomalous events, unusual and unexpected happenings, and you will have to ask yourself whether those circumstances, as well as the scientific evidence and the eyewitness reports, do or do not support the conclusion that a bombing crime was committed. Your job is to examine the totality of the evidence, and you make your judgment as to whether there is reasonable or probable cause that such a bombing crime was committed.
Why does the investigation of 9/11 still matter anyway? I'm testifying today out of concern for the thousands of family members of the victims of 9/11, the survivors, and also the first responders, some of whom you'll hear from today. The family members' cries for accountability and justice have gone unheeded for more than 20 years. I also speak of the thousands of co-petitioners for a special grand jury investigation into the crimes of 9/11. You're likely to learn in your inquiry, as I did so reluctantly years ago, that the key to understanding the crimes of 9/11 begins with the awareness that a third skyscraper collapsed on 9/11. Thank you for taking that step with us today. We start with World Trade Center 7 because we believe that the evidence reveals that the collapse of this building was a planned implosion. I was deeply troubled in 2007 when I learned that our government claimed that it was a collapse due to fire. You will decide the truth of the matter based on the evidence to be provided in this room. And if you determine that the experts testifying today are correct and that the government is wrong, well, then you're left with a much greater set of potential crimes involving the murder of almost 3,000 people at the Twin Towers. But one step at a time. Today, our goal is to present to you overwhelming, irrefutable evidence of the intentional explosive destruction of the World Trade Center Building 7. Let me start by pointing out a sampling of the many evidentiary documents, publications, and videos that we either already have provided or are planning to provide. Several dozen experts in their fields, many of whom will be providing testimony in this proceeding. We have already provided approximately 60 exhibits to the U.S. Attorney for your reference. The following additional documents, books, and films, in whole or in part, are under consideration for supplemental exhibits to the Lawyers Committee Grand Jury Petition. Sudden Collapse by Firefighter Paul Cayley. The 2007 and 2020 Request for Correction submitted to NIST as challenges to the World Trade Center 7 collapse reports by NIST. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain all three high-rise collapses to the American people. Professor Graham McQueen's research, Waiting for 7, World Trade Center Physics, and Beyond Misinformation, What Science Says About the Destruction of World Trade Center Buildings 1, 2, and 7 by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. Relevant books include Another 19, Investigating Legitimate 9/11 Suspects by Kevin Robert Ryan. These books by Professor David Ray Griffin are important for understanding the events of 9/11, the new Pearl Harbor, disturbing questions about the Bush administration and 9/11. The 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Distortions, 9/11 American Empire, Intellectuals Speak Out, Christian Faith and the Truth Behind 9/11, Debunking 9/11 Debunking, 9/11 contradictions, the new Pearl Harbor revisited, the mysterious collapse of World Trade Center 7, Osama bin Laden, dead or alive, cognitive infiltration, 10 years later, 9/11, 9/11 Unmasked, an international review panel investigation. Other excellent books, resources to be submitted include The Terror Timeline, Year by Year, Day by Day, Minute by Minute, a comprehensive chronicle of the road to 9/11, and America's Response by Paul Thompson. Unanswered Questions, What the September 11th Families Asked, and the 9/11 Commission Ignored by Ray McGinnis. Mounting Evidence, Why We Need a New Investigation into 9/11 by Paul W. Ree, Ph.D. 9/11 Unveiled by Enver Massoud. Video documentary evidence to be submitted to the U.S. Attorney includes my 15-minute summary of the evidence presented to you in this hearing called Solving the Mystery of World Trade Center 7. My 2-hour summary, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, The Architecture of Destruction, and 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, in which I assembled 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, and explosive experts who present their studies and findings. Physics, WTC 7 Freefall by David Chandler. My San Francisco press conference with 9/11 researchers when we reached our first 1,000 architects and engineer petition signers. Stephen Jones, 9/11 Revisited. September 11th, New Pearl Harbor by Italian director Massimo Mazzucco, a rebuttal of the 9/11 truth deniers. 9/11 Decade of Deception, the Toronto 3-day hearings with Judge Ferdinand Impassimato from Italy on the bench. NIST, A New Standard for Deception by Kevin Ryan. I hope that these researchers and experts will provide you with useful factual leads for your investigation today.
Let me just note that these many resources you identified could be very useful to the grand jurors and do provide many factual leads for their investigation. We are not presenting these resources as the gospel, and we don't represent that we agree with every statement in them. But in any case, it is the grand jury's task, not ours, to answer the questions about these crimes. So, as I noted, you are, as grand jurors, entitled to consider any evidence, and these resources Richard has pointed you to fall within the material you're entitled to review. Some of these books and articles that provide additional information and evidence that Architect Gage has pointed you to are related to the evidentiary question we're discussing now, which is the bombing crime involving the destruction of World Trade Center buildings on 9/11. Some of these books and other resources go beyond that evidentiary question to the related question of whether there was an attempt to cover up those bombing crimes. And yet, additional portions of these books and other references may help you in investigating the whodunit portion of your task, which is, if you do find that a bombing crime was committed, who was responsible for that crime?
Building 7 was a 47-story high-rise that, on the afternoon of 9/11, after witnesses heard explosions, dropped suddenly, symmetrically, at free-fall acceleration into its own footprint in the exact manner of a classic implosion. And the evidence that you'll see today supports the hypothesis of controlled demolition with explosives. Most people are completely unaware of this building's collapse, so don't feel singled out if you didn't know about it. Building 7 should have been the most studied structural failure in history. But no, architects and engineers are, for the most part, completely unaware of it. Why? The American Institute of Architects, of which I'm one of 90,000 members, didn't issue even one bulletin on this, the third worst structural failure in modern history. In fact, the 9/11 Commission report which was supposed to be telling the whole story of 9/11, doesn't even mention the collapse of the 47-story World Trade Center 7 skyscraper in downtown New York. And the mainstream media has only shown the collapse of this building 2 times after 9/11. The 2008 final report on the collapse by NIST claims that normal office fires brought the building down. You'll see that this is a completely unprecedented event and should therefore require extraordinary supporting evidence on the part of government scientists. And you'll see that they fall quite short of this mark and that they've omitted the most important witnesses and forensic evidence that was available to them. The project leader of the 2008 NIST investigation on Building 7 was Shyam Sunder, and he's the one who provided the details of their investigation in a series of briefings, particularly the technical briefing on August 26, 2008. Let's hear from NIST and Dr. Sunder in this short video from NIST headquarters.
New York City, 2001. No tall building had ever collapsed primarily due to fire. But that's exactly what investigators believe happened to the 47-story World Trade Center Building 7 on September 11th. According to a 3-year comprehensive building and fire safety investigation just completed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. The team found that World Trade Center 7's design was generally consistent with the relevant building codes when it was built.
So, they acknowledge that it was designed to be structurally sound. There are hundreds of buildings similarly designed. So, if the NIST theory is correct, then why have there been absolutely no structural revisions to the International Building Code? Only egress and fireproofing changes. So let's dive into the works of NIST and see if it stands up to scrutiny. We can learn more from Dr. Sunder from his August 26, 2008 technical briefing.
We had 4 objectives when we started this investigation. The overall investigation in August of 2002. One was to determine why and how the World Trade Center buildings collapsed.
NIST says that, but they actually began the investigation with the stated conclusion that it came down by fire. So this was not a real investigation from the start. In fact, we'll be demonstrating that it was a process of reverse engineering in an effort to justify the only hypothesis that they ever seriously considered.
The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
This deception was made easier for them because most of the evidence was destroyed. The late famed scientist Lynn Margulis clarifies.
You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science. It's trying to prove preconceived ideas.
It was part of the World Trade Center complex, just outside the superblock of the World Trade Center buildings. It was developed by Larry Silverstein and his companies in the mid-'80s. Later, in 2001, he took ownership of the entire World Trade Center building complex. The architect of record was Emery Roth & Sons, and the structural engineer was Manhattan skyscraper expert Irwin Cantor. World Trade Center 7 was just 110 yards from the North Tower. When the North Tower was destroyed, some of that debris hit the buildings and started random fires. However, the building remains standing well after the tower's destruction and into the late afternoon. It had sustained some damage from the structural elements ejected from the Twin Towers, but NIST acknowledges that this damage was relatively insignificant factor in the building's collapse. What was the official narrative? Back to Dr. Sunder.
Falling debris from Tower 1 started fires on 10 floors in Building 7.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
destruction appears the same as the old hotels in Las Vegas via an implosion. So it would be intuitive for us to make an assessment that this was brought down by controlled demolition. However, NIST developed an alternative theory.
We really have a new kind of progressive collapse that we have discovered here, which is a fire-induced progressive collapse. So you look at the floors failing here, and eventually this column 79 is going to buckle, it fails, and then the entire vertical progression takes place.
A chain reaction then caused other interior columns to fail in quick succession. The outside shell of the building fell.
This building endured fires for almost 7 hours from the time of collapse of Tower 1 until 5:20 in the afternoon. Floor 12 has extensive fires. Floor 13 has fires. Floor 11 has some fires. Floor 8 has extensive in the sense of the coverage of the floor fires, as well as floor 7. And there's also fires on floor 9.
But these are the worst fires that we have evidence of. You can see that they're few, they're small, and they're scattered throughout the building.
Among the specific questions we asked as we carried out this investigation was, why did this building collapse after having withstood fires for 7 hours? The fire-induced thermal expansion of the floor system surrounding column 79 led to collapse of floor 13. That in turn triggered a cascade of floor failures.
We'll dive into this theory of NIST in an upcoming episode, but for now, let's listen to Shyam Sunder describe the structure of World Trade Center Building 7.
The framing system was designed to distribute the weight of the building and resist lateral or wind loads in this particular case. The gravity loads were supported roughly equally by the exterior columns and the interior columns. There were 58 exterior columns and there were 24 interior columns. This is the core of the building where you have the elevators and the stairwells and the mechanical utility closets and so forth. The column 79, which is shown in red at the northeast corner, was a built-up column with a cover plate, and columns 80 and 81 immediately to the south of column 79 were built-up columns with web plates. And these plates were pretty thick, 3 inches in the case of column 79 in the region of interest to us. But most importantly, you see the east penthouse that is directly over column 79, 80, and the edge of the east penthouse is near column 76, 77. And then the screen wall is the next 3 rows of columns, or 3 lines of columns, and then the west penthouse is the last 3 lines of columns.
NIST doesn't show any photos indicating the massive steel framing members through which a progressive collapse would have to travel, like a hot knife through butter. Did NIST mischaracterize the severity of these fires? Back to Dr. Sunder.
In the case of floor 12, you see the fire starting in the south region, moving toward the east, moving again to the north, and eventually going to the west. And you see that column 79, which is in the northeast corner, is subjected to the heat from this fire on this particular floor for a pretty long time.
So says their fire simulation, yet NIST admits
Fires for the range of combustible contents in World Trade Center 7 persisted in any given location for approximately 20 to 30 minutes.
Well, the fireproofing of the beams and columns in this building, which was built to code, lasts 2 and 3 hours. That's 4 to 6 times longer than the fires last. So how could they get hot enough to expand in the first place? Let's listen to Brendan Murphy, PE, Fire Protection Engineer.
I'm a licensed fire protection engineer with 15 years of experience. We design and safeguard new and existing structures to withstand fires and other hazardous events. The fires in World Trade Center 7 only burn for 20 or 30 minutes because it's a light hazard occupancy. So fires move from one fuel source to another. That's not long enough to penetrate the 2 to 3 hour fire resistive rating of these columns and concrete slabs. It was a type 1 fire resistive construction, which means it was built with reinforced concrete and fireproof steel. It's very solid and is built to withstand temperatures of extreme heat. A light hazard commodity is consistent of desks, paper, chairs, file cabinets, things that burn with relatively low heat release rate. There have been numerous other high-rise steel frame structure fires in history that have suffered no collapse or no structural damage whatsoever.
The true nature of the fires are illustrated quite well in this documentary by Massimo Mazzucco, 9/11 New Pearl Harbor.
The graphic shows the temperatures in floor 12 rising after 1 p.m. and peaking around 4 p.m. on the northeastern side of the building. But the same picture NIST has published in their report, which was taken between 3:49 and 3:54 p.m., shows that the fires have already died off across the entire eastern section of the 12th floor. A similar picture, taken between 3:53 and 4:02 p.m., confirms that the fires on the eastern side of the 12th floor had already died off. NIST itself has stated in the same page that there is no indication of fires burning on the east side of the 12th floor at this time.
As well, we have Paul Cayley clarifying in his illuminating documentary Calling Out Bravo 7 this concept.
If fire survival depends upon fuel availability, the fire will move from fuel to fuel, from combustible to combustible, in accordance with ordinary fire physics, burning out and self-extinguishing as it travels.
The fires are completely burned out on that floor. But the NIST collapse hypothesis of thermal expansion of long-span steel beams requires that the fires burning on the 12th floor at that location at the time of the collapse. So if the fire isn't burning, how can it be expanding the beams? Let's peer into a real fire test in an 8-story steel frame office building that has been set on fire on purpose. We can do that because they had a real fire test in Cardington in the UK in 1995. They had incredible fuel loads, as you can see, trying to get the hottest office fires possible to see how the columns and beams would react in a realistic scenario. Some are fireproofed, many are not. It was a very rigorous test.
The way in which steel-framed buildings behave in fires depends on their construction. In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
When steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, the fires, normal fires, are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
He's of course referring here till 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse due to fire that day. The executive summary of this study cites that this is inherently stable behavior due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. Yet, NIST had 400 structural steel connections failing every second during the 7 seconds of the overall collapse of that building. We haven't lost fireproof steel frame buildings due to fire. Let's look.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, and neither did these fully engulfed high-rises collapse after 9/11. Nevertheless, they made the decision that this particular skyscraper was indeed going to come down.
The decision not to continue evaluating and fighting the fires was made hours before the building collapsed. At around mid-afternoon, somewhere around 2:30, they decided that it's possible that the building could collapse.
Well, that's true, but listen to Chief Peter Hayden.
Well, we had our special operations people set up surveying instruments to monitor and see if there was any movement of the building. We were concerned of the possibility of collapse of the building, and we had a discussion with one particular engineer there, and we asked him if we allowed it to burn, could we anticipate a collapse, and if so, how soon? And it turned out that he was pretty much right on the money, that he said in its current state you have about 5 hours.
Wait a minute. Never before in history have we lost a steel frame fire-protected skyscraper due to office fires. And now, all of a sudden, this engineer is predicting that not only will it come down, but in about 5 hours? And it does! And Chief Hayden won't release the name of this engineer. He remains anonymous.
In regard to the grand jury's authority to investigate, a good example of the breadth of your authority is provided in considering Chief Hayden's remark that an unidentified engineer advised him that Building 7 would collapse in about 5 hours on 9/11, and in fact did so. And you also have the authority to require the testimony of the unidentified engineer who reportedly provided the unprecedented opinion that a steel-framed high-rise would fall as a result of fires, keeping in mind that Building 7, unlike the Twin Towers, had not been hit by an airplane. So it is within your authority to ask the engineer what his or her bases were for drawing this conclusion and to follow any leads provided, because the most plausible explanation for that unprecedented opinion is that the unidentified engineer had some reason to believe Building 7 was in fact going to collapse beyond mere knowledge of building construction and fire dynamics, which as of that point in history was understood to mean that steel-framed buildings would not collapse due to fire. So this is fully within your authority to investigate as you see fit.
Let's find out if firefighters have changed their tactics and strategies as a result of the NIST findings that a building can come down on top of them now due to a progressive collapse because of fires.
Hello, members of the grand jury. My name is Erik, and I have over 25 years of emergency services experience. My last 16 years was with the Seattle Fire Department. Our tactics have not changed. We put a command center in the lobby of the building. All these types of things. World Trade Center 7 is the first Type 1 concrete and steel frame high-rise that has ever collapsed due to fire. This should have been the most thorough, protected, overanalyzed, over-tested, ongoing for probably months to years to determine how did this happen. It's never happened before, and everything should have radically shifted. So that's what should have been done. NFPA 921 sets those basic standards. And if you have an investigation like Tower 7, you're going to go way beyond. Not only going to follow the minimums, you're going to go way beyond the testing that NFPA 921 calls for. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, they themselves admit they did not follow the NFPA 921. Now think about it. First time ever in history, a Type 1 concrete and steel frame high-rise has ever collapsed. Do you think that fire meets that criteria? No, it does not. Ordinary office fires have never done it and cannot bring down a Type 1. If we're going to take the first high-rise building that has ever collapsed due to fire, ordinary office fires, we need to know how that happened and why that happened. Now, to put it in perspective, most firefighters do not know there was a third tower that collapsed. They've forgotten about it. If they're reminded, they don't even know the story really. So that hasn't been talked about. We need to get to the bottom of what happened to this building so it doesn't happen again.
And lend an ear to this former fire commissioner and chief in the New York area.
Members of the grand jury, my name is Christopher Gioia, and I'm a former fire commissioner and an ex-chief in the Franklin Square and Munson Fire Department in New York. And I do heavy construction, and I actually helped to build skyscrapers in Manhattan, among other heavy construction projects. There's protocols that have to be followed, especially when it comes to investigating fire and explosion incidents, and the federal agencies that were tasked with doing the investigation didn't follow these protocols at all. They ignored them. You have NFPA 921, and then you have NFPA 1033, which relates to the professional qualifications for people who are going to investigate such incidents. So I question the validity of any government report, especially by NIST, which came out with a report that said that Building 7 came down because of fire, and I absolutely disagree with that.
And the professional opinion of a high-rise architect.
My name is David Mack, Associate AIA. I hold a bachelor's degree in architecture from Notre Dame and a master's degree in construction management from the University of Denver. I have worked with prominent high-rise architects and construction managers in New York City and Philadelphia. I worked with the office of Irwin Cantor, the structural designer for World Trade Center 7. World Trade Center 7 was state-of-the-art, both structurally and in terms of fire construction methods, fire suppression systems, and life safety systems. More than 3,500 architects and engineers, including myself, have examined the evidence about Building 7's collapse, have signed a petition, and say that the building could not have been brought down by office fires. In early 1991, I was an eyewitness to the One Meridian Plaza high-rise office fire in Philadelphia, Center City. which raged much larger, hotter, and longer, 19 hours, destroying 8 floors without loss of structural stability. World Trade Center 7 was never investigated per the National Fire Prevention Association guidelines.
Consider the testimony of Captain Raul Angulo of the Seattle Fire Department, author of the major textbook on firefighting.
I want to thank the grand jury for having me. My name is Raul Angulo. I'm a retired captain from the Seattle Fire Department with over 38 years of service on the line. I've written numerous articles for Fire Engineering magazine and all the major publications. I have over 350 published articles in the various publications over my career. But most recently, I'm a book author of the textbook Engine Company Fireground Operations, the 4th edition, which is published by Jones and Bartlett Learning in conjunction with NFPA. This is the most recent and thorough textbook on firefighter training for engine company operations. There's a Highrise chapter in this textbook. This textbook is distributed all over the country, even internationally. But it is the most comprehensive and most newest training textbook on the market. Firefighters are trusted individuals. We carry the public trust. We're well educated, we're well respected, and we have a lot of training in building construction and fire dynamics. Fire dynamics is just the behavior of fire. When I write a textbook, I have to write what I believe is the most accurate and truthful information, because firefighter lives are going to depend on the information that I'm putting to pen in textbook format. A lot of the information that I get is going to come from scientific and professional organizations like NIST, UL Laboratories, the NFA, National Fire Academy, the U.S. Fire Administration, NIOSH. So a lot of the firefighter fatalities and investigations are done through these organizations, as well as scientific study and experiments. And so when they publish information, I'm assuming that it's true, and I'm going to rely on their truthfulness and the integrity of their work for me to pass on, incorporate into my work and experience, and then pass it on to firefighters. So it needs to be accurate. And what I found in researching the collapse of Building 7 does not match with the information that NIST put out. Now, Building 7 is a Type 1 construction, high-rise structure, steel, fireproof coating per the code for Type 1 buildings. These are the strongest buildings that we have in American architecture. They're built to resist gravity, they're built for height, and they're built for high occupancy function, meaning they're built to house a lot of people. There's numerous examples of high-rise buildings in my studies. Not a single one of these buildings collapsed as a result of fire. You know, high-rise buildings are basically incinerators. They're built to consume the fire load on each floor, that if we cannot fight it as firefighters, basically the fire will burn out. That's the case in Building 7. It was a fully sprinklered building. It had an automatic fire alarm system. It had ventilation systems and the standpipes and the sprinklers to help us control fires in these buildings. Interesting to note, though, that the automatic fire alarm panel in Building 7 was turned off.
For some unknown reason, on the morning of 9/11, Building 7's Firecom automatic main scheme alarm system had been deactivated for 8 hours at 6:47 a.m.
Why? They said it was for testing, but that doesn't make sense.
Was there a water supply for the fire sprinkler system?
And had a water supply for the automatic sprinkler system been available, and had the sprinkler system operated as designed, it is likely that fires in WTC 7 would have been controlled and the collapse prevented.
This claim does not stand up to proper scrutiny. New York City's water is gravity-fed by large aqueducts flowing from north to south. The water pressure for Lower Manhattan south of 14th Street is regulated before entering a network of multiple 20-inch north to south primary mains with 12-inch diameter secondary mains in each street to provide water supplies to individual buildings. There are 20-inch primary mains in West Street, Greenwich, West Broadway, Church Street and Broadway, bringing water south towards the World Trade Center. The claim of failed local water supplies as a reason for a fire being left to burn makes little sense. It was proposed by NIST that the water supply to Building 7 may have been compromised by damage from the falling towers in the morning. However, as explained, the mains water supply on Manhattan runs from north to south, with Building 7 positioned north and upstream of the towers. A 2002 privately commissioned fire science and engineering investigation specifically looked into the water supply available to firefighting operations on 9/11. It identified very healthy water pressures ranging from 44 to 60 psi at the 14th Street pressure regulators between 6:40 a.m. and 11:50 a.m. on the morning of 9/11. Their report stated, the collapse of the towers did not have any effect on pressures at the 14th Street regulators. Hydraulic calculations clearly show that the robust municipal water distribution system of Manhattan had the capacity to deliver even more water than was consumed. The NIST reports themselves are littered with information identifying healthy water supplies after the collapse of the towers. This picture was taken shortly after 10:30 a.m. Building 7 is in the background to the right, behind the fire appliance at the corner of Barclay and Washington Street. Notice the swollen hose delivering water to the pump. The firefighters are operating the appliance and manoeuvring a charged hose to put out a car fire in the distance. Volume 1 of NIST's Structural Fire Response Report reads, between 11 a.m. and 12 noon, approximately 40 FDNY members arrived at WTC 7 with orders to put the fires out inside WTC 7. Inside, they surveyed conditions and reported seeing small fires. The chief officer, who had been inside the building about 20 to 25 minutes, went to the FDNY command post and reported to the command post chief that he believed the fires inside WTC 7 could be extinguished. Thus, the chief went back to extinguish the fires. He would not have done this without a good water supply. Here we can see World Trade Center Building 5, which was south of 7, but still had a good water supply for firefighting, as did other locations south of 7. In a formal legal interview under oath, FDNY Chief Peter Hayden of Division 1 was asked about water availability at Building 7. He confirmed that water was available and standpipes were in operation. This footage also shows the sprinkler system in Building 7 delivering water to a lower floor. The first 20 lower floors were supplied with water from the street main system. According to all the evidence, water supplies clearly were not an issue for firefighting at Building 7.
You've got another example of a government report which is describing a factual scenario that doesn't comport with reality. And as grand jurors, you have to ask yourself, why would an author of a government report misrepresent a basic fact, like were the sprinklers working or not? And then you have to decide what inference to draw from that. You may also want to call in some witnesses to know what happened with the sprinklers. So you as grand jurors have the authority to get to the bottom of evidentiary discrepancies, like, was there a loss of water pressure? Was there a loss of available water for the firefighters to use in fighting the Building 7 fire or not? And you can see from the evidence presented, there is a discrepancy here. So you have the power to examine witnesses, to subpoena documents, and get to the bottom why NIST is giving apparently incorrect information regarding this purported loss of water, which apparently did not happen. And more importantly, you want to get to the bottom of why would NIST feel the need to say that.
So if you look at Building 7 all by itself, on any other given day, this would be the #1 case study in every magazine, every textbook, all the national fire conferences. We'd be studying the collapse of Building 7 for months, years on end. And we don't. It's barely mentioned. Firefighters don't even know that there was a third building that collapsed on September 11th. The columns on high-rise firefighting, that's what holds up each floor, they're rated for 3 hours, and the floors are rated for 2 hours. I believe on each floor of World Trade Center 7, there's 81 columns, and NIST is reporting that one failure of a column out of 81 is going to cause a collapse. They're claiming that the fire load was significant enough that it would weaken these structures. I'm sorry, but the video evidence on that just does not support that statement. I'm a fire commander, I'm a fire captain, and I'm the one who has to make a judgment call on whether this fire is something that we can attack and fight from the interior, or if it's so big that we cannot fight the fire. We're going to let it burn itself out. We'll contain it and prevent it from spreading. So that's a judgment call made by fire officers and chief officers. I do have those qualifications. The doctor from NIST, I'm sorry, does not. He's not a firefighter. He may be a professor and an engineer, but he's not making those type of decisions. I am. Now look at all the video footage, and I'm saying this is a fightable fire. There is no reason why we would expect this entire building to collapse. And there's spectacular ones in Beijing, China, and in Chechnya, around the world. There's spectacular fires, and you're going, oh my gosh, this is going to collapse. And they haven't, in fact, including the first interstate fire. So you look at the NFPA 1700. This was published last year, and this is the Guide for Structural Firefighting. In Chapter 12, they talk about high-rise fires. And in there, we're still talking about operating in a forward position, which means our staging area is going to be 2 floors below the fire floor. And those are safe places of refuge. Based on what? Based on the construction and the strength of type 1 high-rise buildings. We don't evacuate the entire building. We do not. It's too chaotic. That was one of the problems in the World Trade Centers. You had legal but narrow stairwells, and as people are funneling out of the building, the firefighters are trying to go up. So you have opposing traffic in the stairwell. That's one reason why we don't dump. That's the term we use for evacuating everybody. We don't dump the entire building. We want to move them to a place of refuge where we can protect in place. In the NFPA 1700, there is no mention about thermal expansion causing steel to collapse from fires. No, none, no mention of it. And yet what NIST is saying that it's this new phenomenon.
We really have a new kind of progressive collapse that we have discovered here, which is a fire-induced progressive collapse.
If what NIST is saying is true, and if their narrative is correct, that means we have to change the way we attack interior high-rise fires. We have to change our entire strategy and tactics. And we have to expect that this building's going to come down on firefighters and the public alike. Instead of defending in place, we would have to do an aggressive, rapid evacuation of the entire building. But we don't do that. The NFPA 1700, the most recent document coming out, doesn't state that. My textbook is the most recent book out there for training firefighters. I'm not stating that. We're going to continue to fight fires the way we have. Even in as early as the last National Fire Conference at the Fire Department's Instructors Conference, there was no mention of thermal expansion resulting in progressive collapses in high-rise buildings.
The fire-induced thermal expansion of the floor system surrounding column 79 led to collapse of floor 13. That in turn triggered a cascade of floor failures.
So one of us is right, one of us is wrong, but we both can't be right. I have to stick to the information that I know is reliable. I believe the existing information on the strength and construction of Type 1 high-rise buildings, and that they are going to endure fire. Our main dangers are dealing with smoke, heat, the lack of ventilation, the lack of access. Our last concern in high-rise buildings is collapse. As a result of the information presented in my textbook, I was invited this year to the NFPA conference. There I had spoken with over 100 colleagues, firefighters, fire chiefs, building engineers, architects, and over 300 of them signed up for more information on this subject. Many of these firefighters had no knowledge that there was a third collapse. But when I presented my information and my arguments, as well as looking at the video footage of what they were seeing, they came to the same conclusions. I really didn't have anybody actually challenge my position. I didn't have anybody stick up for the NIST narrative. They tended to agree with me. It's just really an issue of trust and integrity, and I'm looking for the truth because I have to write about that, and firefighter lives depend on that. I believe in the physics and the science, not political science, actual, natural, scientific science.
So members of the grand jury, you're faced with a problem that many trial juries are faced with here, competing expert opinion and testimony, and you'll have to decide how to address the inconsistencies between, for example, engineers from NIST and their conclusions versus Captain Angulo and his conclusions, which are also the same conclusions you're hearing from other experts, including my colleague, Architect Richard Gage. The testimony you'll be hearing, not only from Richard, but the expert witnesses, will be the equivalent of testimony live to the grand jury. And by that I mean it will be under oath. Richard and the experts will be submitting signed declaration, which will make clear that their statements made in this series are under oath, under penalty of perjury, that those statements are true and correct. So how does a grand juror decide which expert to credit on a complicated technical question in an area where you as a grand juror may not have special training? And it's sometimes difficult, and in many trials it is difficult. We get into what's called a battle of experts, where, one side puts forward a highly paid expert to give their opinion on inferences from a limited set of data regarding events that cannot be directly observed. The other side does the same. And, that can be a difficult choice to make. But I don't think you're faced with that challenge here. And the reason I say that is there are two distinctions that make this situation with regard to Captain Angulo's testimony versus an engineer from NIST, not the typical battle of experts. First of all, Captain Angulo is, when he draws a conclusion about is it safe to go into a building, is it safe to fight a fire in a steel frame high-rise from within, rather than fearing it's going to collapse completely. When he draws that conclusion and acts on it, he's putting his own life on the line. He's also putting the lives of his colleagues on the line, in addition to those in the building. So he has to have an extreme level of confidence in making a judgment like that. It's not a decision to be made lightly, and he's made clear that that's a decision that he's made. And he continues to act on it, and he teaches others to act on the fact that steel frame buildings are not going to completely collapse as a result of fires alone. So that's one important distinction. The other important distinction is here, you're not talking about just comparing opinion to opinion. There's a lot of independent freestanding evidence. My colleague, Architect Gage, is presenting a lot of that to you. You'll be hearing more of it. And a lot of it isn't just opinion. It's measurements from scientific instruments, it's observations, videotapes, eyewitness testimony. But in this case, as Captain Angulo points out, you have a videotape of Building 7's collapse that's been preserved for history, and the conclusions drawn by NIST are simply not consistent with what's observed in the behavior of Building 7 when it collapsed, as recorded on video. So this is not a sort of a he said, she said battle of experts where you don't have anything else to help you draw proper conclusions and decide whom to believe.
Join us for our next episode, number 3. The grand jury confronts the sudden, symmetrical destruction of Building 7. We'll start with the forces that do destroy buildings, by natural causes, like earthquakes, and by explosions. In fact, we'll examine the specific features of controlled demolitions and compare them to the features of Building 7's destruction. We highlight an actual physics teacher, David Chandler, to expose the grand jury to the false physics of NIST as we discuss the sudden onset of Building 7. We highlight structural engineer Kamal Obeid to show the impossibility of a symmetrical collapse of the structural system by normal office fires. We bring on explosives loader Tom Sullivan to show us how they achieve the straight-down symmetrical collapse in controlled implosions. All, of course, with striking legal commentary for the grand jury from LC911's litigation director, attorney Mick Harrison. So don't miss episode number 3. We want to hear from you. We don't want you to just watch 9/11 crime scene to courtroom. We're inviting you to serve as virtual grand jurors during each episode. And we're encouraging you to judge the evidence as if you were yourself a grand juror. And you can provide us your individual assessment of the veracity of the evidence and the eyewitness testimony. And give us your feedback on our website, 911crimescenetocourtroom.org, or simpler, 911c2c.org. We can incorporate changes and improvements provided by you in the upcoming series. Then join us for an online conference call immediately following the release of each episode. Don't worry, we'll remind you when you add your email to the C2C release reminder list. Here's more that you can do on the 911c2c.org website. Share evidence and investigative strategies with our team. Suggest potential witnesses for the grand jurors to question. Put potential witnesses and whistleblowers in contact with our team. And of course, donate to the 911 C2C effort. Actually, these initial C2C episodes are more of a beginning than an end. Until 9/11 transparency and accountability are achieved, our investigation will be ongoing. It's all on the website, 911crimescenetocourtroom.org, or simpler, again, 911c2c.org.